The sea is perfectly still, a sheet of dark blue glass beneath a fading sky. Somewhere in the distance, waves whisper against stone cliffs, and the warm air carries the scent of salt, olive leaves, and ancient earth. An island emerges from the twilight, not conquered, not fortified, but alive, breathing, waiting. This is Crete. Before empires marched, before legends hardened into myth, a civilization rose here guided not by war, but by balance, not by walls, but by trust. Painted palaces without fortresses, gods without faces, a people who ruled the sea without ruling through fear, and whose world would one day vanish almost without a sound. This is a story of beauty and power, of ritual and resilience, of fire from the sea and shadows from the mainland. A story of how a civilization can rise at the center of the world and fade into memory, leaving only echoes behind. As you imagine standing on a quiet shore at dusk, ask yourself, what would you notice first? The sound of waves moving like breath, or the distant glow of a palace beyond the hills? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from, and whether it's morning, evening, or night for you. If this journey calls to you, gently tap like and subscribe, and let these stories find you again. Now dim your screen, let the night close in, and step back with us to a time before the palaces, before the myths. Long before the first palace walls rose beneath the Cretan sun, before painted corridors and echoing courtyards, the island existed in a quieter, older rhythm. Crete lay stretched between three continents, cradled by the Aegean Sea, its mountains lifting slowly from the water like the spine of a resting animal. Winds moved freely across its ridges, carrying the smell of pine, wild herbs, and salt. The sea whispered constantly along its shores, shaping coves and beaches grain by grain, year by year, century by century. In these earliest times, there were no cities to name, no kings to remember. Human life arrived gently, almost tentatively. Small groups crossed the water in simple boats, drawn by the promise of fertile land and fresh springs. They stepped onto rocky shores and sandy inlets, listening first, watching carefully, learning the moods of the island before shaping it to their needs. The people who settled here lived close to the earth. They learned where water pooled after winter rains, where soil stayed rich and dark, where goats could graze without wandering too far. The mountains provided shelter and stone, while the valleys offered grain and olives. Everywhere the sea remained present, not a boundary, but a companion. It fed them, guided them, and quietly taught them how the wider world moved beyond the horizon. At night, fires flickered softly outside simple dwellings made of mud brick and timber. Smoke rose straight into the calm sky. Stories were spoken rather than written, shaped by memory and repetition. These were not tales of conquest or empire, but of seasons, animals, storms, and stars. Children learned the names of winds before they learned the names of ancestors. Survival depended not on dominance, but on balance, knowing when to plant, when to wait, when to listen. Over generations, this knowledge deepened. The people of early Crete learned to read the land the way one reads a familiar face. They understood how earthquakes could ripple through the ground without warning, how sudden storms could scatter boats, how drought could follow abundance. Instead of fighting these forces, they adapted to them. Homes were rebuilt, fields replanted, lives continued with patience and resilience. Slowly, villages began to form, not crowded or imposing, but clustered and communal. Homes gathered near fresh water and arable land, connected by narrow paths worn smooth by bare feet. There was no strict divide between work and ritual, between survival and meaning. Grinding grain, tending animals, shaping clay, all carried a quiet sense of rhythm and purpose. Even the act of gathering food could become a shared ceremony, guided by habit and mutual trust. Pottery emerged as one of the first clear expressions of Minoan identity, though no one yet used that name. Clay vessels were shaped by hand, fired in open hearths, and decorated with simple patterns inspired by the natural world. Waves, spirals, and plant forms appeared again and again, echoing the environment that surrounded them. These early designs were not meant to impress distant rulers. They were made for daily use, for holding water, grain, oil, the essentials of life. As centuries passed, these communities grew more confident. Trade began quietly, almost invisibly. Obsidian from distant islands appeared in Cretan tools, sharp and dark, proof of journeys made across open water. These exchanges were not grand expeditions, but careful, repeated crossings, guided by stars and shorelines. With each voyage, the sea became less of a mystery and more of a familiar path. The island's position encouraged this outward gaze. Crete sat at a crossroads, whether its inhabitants fully realized it or not. To the north lay the Greek mainland. To the east, the ancient lands of Anatolia. To the south, Egypt and the rich cultures of the Near East. Even in these early centuries, ideas drifted across the water. New tools, new crops, new ways of shaping the world, arriving slowly, absorbed thoughtfully, rather than imposed. Yet for all this contact, Crete remained distinct. There is little evidence of fortifications from this early period. No massive walls, no signs of constant warfare. Instead, the archaeological traces suggest a society that placed value on cooperation and continuity. Conflict may have existed, as it always does among humans, but it did not dominate daily life or define identity. Ritual, too, began to take shape in these early centuries. Sacred spaces were often found outdoors. Caves, mountain peaks, secluded groves. These were places where the natural world felt especially alive, where the boundary between human and divine seemed thin. Offerings were simple: pottery, small figurines, food, perhaps a whispered hope carried upward by the wind. The divine was not distant or commanding. It was present in the landscape itself. Women appear to have held a visible, respected place in these early communities. Figurines suggest reverence for fertility, growth, and renewal, forces embodied in the rhythms of both land and human life. While much remains uncertain, the emphasis on nurturing, continuity, and balance would later become one of the most striking features of Minoan culture. Time passed slowly, marked more by seasons than by years. Generations were born, lived, and returned to the earth without leaving written records behind. And yet, they were laying foundations, not of stone palaces, but of shared customs, artistic traditions, and social trust. These invisible structures would support everything that followed. By the late Neolithic period, Crete was no longer merely inhabited. It was settled with intention. Fields were carefully maintained, livestock selectively bred, tools refined. The people understood their island deeply now. Its generosity, its dangers, its quiet power. They were no longer visitors from elsewhere. They were Cretans. And somewhere within this long, patient relationship between people and place, something new was beginning to stir. Population increased, surpluses grew, villages expanded, drawing closer together. The need for coordination, for shared storage, for communal decision-making slowly emerged. Not yet palaces, but the first hints of central spaces where people gathered, exchanged goods, and resolved disputes. The sea continued its endless motion, carrying both opportunity and uncertainty. Boats grew sturdier, voyages grew longer. The horizon no longer felt like an edge, but an invitation. And as the island breathed in this new era, shaped by stone, sea, and memory, the quiet groundwork of a civilization was being laid, almost unnoticed, as the people of Crete moved forward together, step by unhurried step, toward a future that would soon rise in painted walls and open courts, just beyond the gentle turning of time. As the generations of early Cretans settled more deeply into their island home, the land itself began to guide their way of thinking. Crete was not merely a place to live upon, it was a constant presence, shaping every decision, every habit, every quiet belief about how the world worked. Long and narrow, stretched east to west like a bridge laid across the sea, the island seemed designed to invite movement while still offering shelter. Mountains rose sharply from the coastline, their slopes folded with ravines and hidden plateaus. In winter, snow gathered on their peaks, visible even from the shore. In summer, they held cooler air and precious springs. These high places divided the island into regions, each with its own character, its own rhythms. Travel over land required patience and knowledge, encouraging communities to grow self-reliant, yet never completely isolated. Between the mountains lay fertile plains, warmed by sunlight and refreshed by seasonal rains. Here, grain ripened slowly, olive trees twisted their roots deep into the soil, and vines crept along low stone walls. Agriculture demanded attention and care, but the land rewarded those who listened. This steady exchange between effort and return helped foster a worldview built on balance rather than excess. And always there was the sea. No point on Crete lies far from water. From nearly every hilltop the horizon gleams blue. The sea defined direction, distance, and possibility. It cooled the air, softened the heat of summer, and brought fish to the shore. Unlike vast continental interiors, where land stretches endlessly, Crete's world felt intimate and open at the same time, contained, yet connected. For the people of early Crete, the sea was not an enemy to be feared, nor a barrier to be defended against. It was a road, calm more often than violent, predictable once understood. It encouraged travel, rather than isolation. Learning to read the winds, the currents, and the changing colour of the water became second nature. Even simple boats, hugging the coastline at first, slowly ventured farther out, guided by stars and memory. This closeness to the sea shaped the Minoan temperament long before the Minoans had a name. Instead of turning inward, the island looked outward. Contact with other lands did not arrive as sudden invasions, but as gradual exchanges. A new tool here, a different style of pottery there. Ideas arrived gently, absorbed and adapted rather than copied outright. Crete's central position made this possible. To the north lay the Greek mainland, close enough to reach within days. To the east, the islands of the Aegean formed stepping stones toward Anatolia. To the south, the open sea led toward Egypt and the cultures of the eastern Mediterranean. Crete sat quietly among these worlds, close enough to all, dominated by none. This geography discouraged the rigid borders and constant warfare that marked many later civilizations. There was no single direction from which danger always came, no endless frontier to defend. Instead, there were many routes, many neighbors, many possibilities. The island's natural defensibility, mountains inland, sea all around, allowed its people to feel secure without enclosing themselves behind walls. Even the absence of large rivers shaped Minoan life. Without powerful waterways to dictate settlement patterns, communities remained flexible. Water was gathered from springs and rainfall, managed carefully, shared communally. This encouraged cooperation rather than control. No single group could easily dominate such a system. The rhythm of the seasons further softened the island's character. Winters were mild. Summers were long and bright, tempered by sea breezes. Life unfolded outdoors as much as indoors. Work, rest, ritual, and social life blended together beneath open skies. This closeness to nature nurtured a spiritual outlook rooted not in fear of the unknown, but in familiarity with it. Sacred spaces often reflected this relationship. Rather than towering temples, early Cretans turned to caves, mountain peaks, and open-air sanctuaries. These places were not built to impress. They were chosen because they already felt powerful. A cave breathed cool air from the depths of the earth. A mountaintop offered wide views and open sky. Divinity was encountered through experience, not architecture. This intimacy with the land also shaped how authority developed. Leadership likely emerged through respect and trust rather than force. Knowledge of seasons, navigation, rituals, and resources carried weight. Those who understood the island best were naturally listened to. Power, at least in these early stages, flowed quietly rather than violently. Over time, the island's geography encouraged specialization. Coastal communities became skilled fishers and sailors. Inland villages focused on farming and herding. Mountain regions provided stone, timber, and refuge. These differences created interdependence. Goods moved along paths and shorelines. Relationships formed through exchange rather than conquest. Even communication was shaped by the land. Paths wound through valleys and over ridges, following the contours of the earth rather than cutting straight through it. Travel took time. Messages were carried by people, not symbols. This slowness fostered patience and memory. News spread gradually, allowing ideas to settle and integrate. The island taught resilience as well. Earthquakes reminded its inhabitants that stability was never permanent. Storms could interrupt travel, crops could fail, yet recovery was always possible. The sea calmed again, the ground stilled, fields were replanted. Life continued, shaped by acceptance rather than denial of uncertainty. All of this, the mountains, the plains, the sea, the climate, worked together to form a people comfortable with movement and change. The Cretans did not rush toward dominance. They did not build early monuments to proclaim power. Instead, they cultivated networks, skills, and shared practices that allowed them to adapt smoothly as complexity increased. As populations slowly grew and communities drew closer together, this geographic foundation would make larger coordination possible. Trade networks expanded, resources were gathered and redistributed. Central gathering places began to form, not as symbols of control, but as natural extensions of a connected landscape. The island had already taught its people how to live between worlds, land and sea, stability and motion, tradition and openness. When the first palaces eventually rose, they would not stand in defiance of the land, but in harmony with it, open, flowing, and deeply shaped by the geography that had guided Crete from the very beginning. And as the sun dipped low each evening, casting long shadows across fields and hills, the island continued its quiet instruction, preparing its people for the next gentle turning of their shared story. As the long centuries unfolded across Crete, the quiet rhythm of village life began to deepen and change. What had once been scattered settlements, loosely tied by shared customs and seasonal movement, slowly grew more rooted. People stayed longer in one place. Homes were repaired rather than abandoned. Fields were tended year after year, their boundaries remembered and respected. The island was no longer simply inhabited. It was organized carefully and thoughtfully by human hands. Villages expanded not through sudden growth, but through steady accumulation. A new family joined an old cluster of homes. A path worn by daily travel became a recognized route. Storage spaces grew larger, signaling harvests abundant enough to plan beyond the next season. This slow transformation created a new sense of continuity. Life was no longer shaped only by immediate survival, but by memory and expectation. Homes themselves reflected this change. Simple round or rectangular dwellings became more refined, built with stone foundations and mud brick walls. Roofs were supported by wooden beams, offering shade from the sun and protection from winter rains. Inside, spaces were divided with intention, areas for sleeping, storing food, preparing meals. These were not luxurious structures, but they were carefully made, expressing pride in place and permanence. At the heart of many villages, communal areas emerged, open spaces where people gathered to share meals, exchange goods, and resolve disputes. These spaces mattered. They allowed cooperation to flourish, encouraging a sense of shared responsibility. Decisions were likely made through discussion and consensus rather than command. The community itself became a living structure, stronger than any single building. Food production grew more sophisticated. Farmers learned which crops thrived in which soils, how to rotate fields, how to protect harvests from pests and weather. Olive trees, once wild, were carefully cultivated. Their oil became essential for food, light, and ritual. Grain harvests were stored in clay-lined pits or large jars, creating a buffer against uncertainty. This ability to store surplus changed everything. Time itself seemed to stretch. With surplus came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some people became skilled potters, shaping clay with practiced hands. Others worked stone, wood, or bone. Tools improved, becoming more efficient and more finely made. Craft was no longer merely functional, it carried identity. Designs repeated within families and villages, marking belonging through pattern and form. Pottery, in particular, evolved into a quiet language. Bowls, jars, and cups were shaped with care, decorated with flowing lines, spirals, and natural motifs. These designs echoed waves, plants, and movement, reflecting a worldview deeply connected to the environment. Each vessel carried the imprint of its maker, turning everyday objects into expressions of continuity and meaning. Trade between villages increased, both inland and along the coast. Paths grew busier, boats carried goods between settlements, strengthening ties across the island. This exchange encouraged trust and familiarity. People came to know not only their neighbours, but the wider rhythm of the island. Differences in dialect, custom or style existed, but they did not divide. Instead, they enriched the shared culture. Ritual life also became more visible during this period. Small shrines appeared within villages and nearby natural spaces. Figurines of humans and animals were placed carefully, sometimes broken deliberately, suggesting acts of offering rather than loss. These rituals marked transitions, births, harvests, seasons, reinforcing the bond between people, land, and the unseen forces they felt around them. Women continued to play a central role in both daily life and ritual expression. Artistic representations emphasize movement, fertility, and renewal. Leadership may have been shared or situational, rooted in knowledge and experience, rather than rigid hierarchy. This balance contributed to social stability, allowing growth without fracturing. As populations increased, the need for coordination grew. Water sources were managed collectively. Storage areas became larger and more centralized. Paths connected not just nearby homes, but entire regions. This was not yet urban life, but it was moving towards something more complex. A network of communities bound by cooperation rather than control. Communication expanded beyond immediate experience. Stories grew richer, carrying memories of ancestors, migrations, and lessons learned from hardship. These oral traditions preserved identity, reminding each generation where they came from and how they belonged to the island. In the absence of writing, memory itself became a cultural foundation. The sea remained a constant presence in this growing complexity. Boats improved, journeys lengthened. Contacts with other islands and distant shores increased slowly but steadily. New materials appeared, metals, rare stones, unfamiliar styles, each one absorbed into local tradition rather than replacing it. Crete learned without losing itself. By the end of this phase, the island was ready for transformation. The ingredients of a more complex society were already present: surplus, specialization, trade, shared ritual, and collective decision-making. All that was missing was a new architectural expression, a place where these threads could come together. The villages of Crete had done their work quietly and patiently. They had shaped a people accustomed to cooperation, creativity, and balance. And as the paths between settlements grew more travelled and gatherings drew larger crowds, the idea of a central place, open, communal, and enduring, began to take form in the shared imagination. Just beyond the horizon of this village world, the first palaces were waiting to rise, not as symbols of domination, but as natural extensions of a society that had learned, slowly and carefully, how to live together on an island shaped by stone, sea, and time. The change did not arrive suddenly, nor with the clash of arms or the command of a single ruler. Instead, it unfolded the way most lasting changes do, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the island felt different. Villages still dotted the plains and hills of Crete, but now their paths seemed to lead somewhere. Goods flowed more regularly, gatherings grew larger, decisions carried wider consequences, and at certain favoured locations, the idea of a shared centre began to take physical shape. Among these places, one would come to stand above the rest: Knossos. Set inland from the northern coast, surrounded by fertile land and close to vital routes, Knossos did not dominate the landscape through height or isolation. it settled into it. The ground here was generous, the climate forgiving, the access to sea and interior balanced. It was the kind of place where people naturally gathered, first to trade, then to store, then to organize. The earliest palace at Knossos was not the maze of legend, nor the grand structure later generations would uncover. It was modest by comparison, built gradually, layer by layer, as needs evolved. Open courtyards formed its heart, wide spaces where people met under the sun, sheltered by surrounding buildings but never enclosed from the sky. These courtyards mattered. They were not merely architectural features, but expressions of a world view that valued openness, visibility, and shared presence. Around them rose storerooms, workshops, and administrative spaces. Long rows of clay jars, pithoi, lined cool corridors holding grain, oil, and wine. These stores represented more than wealth. They were security, memory, and trust made tangible. Harvests from surrounding communities flowed inward, not as tribute enforced by violence, but as part of a system that redistributed resources when needed. The palace was not a fortress. Its walls were not thick, its entrances not hidden. There were no great defensive barriers, no watchtowers scanning for enemies. Instead, the architecture flowed, corridors turning gently, staircases rising and descending with surprising grace. Light wells drew the sun deep into the building, illuminating interior spaces and softening shadows. Even movement through the palace felt deliberate, almost calming. This design reflected the society that built it. Authority existed, but it was not expressed through intimidation. Power was administrative, ritual, and symbolic rather than military. Those who worked within the palace managed goods, organized labor, recorded exchanges, and oversaw ceremonies. They coordinated rather than commanded, connecting communities across the island. Art blossomed within these new spaces. Walls were painted with scenes of nature and motion, dolphins leaping through blue water, lilies bending in the breeze, figures dancing or participating in ritual. These images were not stiff or formal. They moved, they breathed. They reminded all who passed through that life itself was dynamic, flowing, and sacred. The presence of art in administrative spaces is telling. Beauty was not reserved for temples or elites alone. It permeated daily life, reinforcing shared values and emotional connection. To walk through the palace was to move through a story, one that celebrated harmony between humans, animals, and the natural world. Knossos also became a centre of craft. Skilled artisans worked nearby, producing fine pottery, metalwork, and textiles. Their creations travelled outward along trade routes, carrying Minoan style far beyond the island. These objects were not anonymous commodities. They carried the aesthetic language of Crete, flowing lines, natural forms, balanced proportions, quietly shaping how others saw this island culture. As the palace system expanded, similar centres emerged elsewhere on Crete: Vaistos, Malea, Zakros. Each had its own character, shaped by local geography and tradition, yet all shared common features: open courtyards, storage facilities, ritual spaces, and administrative functions. Together, they formed a network rather than a hierarchy. Knossos may have been the largest, but it was not alone. The rise of palaces changed social life in subtle but profound ways. Labour became more organised. Large building projects required coordination across villages, quarrying stone, shaping timber, transporting materials. Participation in such work reinforced shared identity. People did not build for a distant ruler. They built for a system that, in turn, supported them. Writing began to emerge during this period, though it remained limited in scope. Symbols were used to record goods and transactions, not stories or laws. This early script, known later as Cretan hieroglyphic and then Linear A, served practical needs. It allowed administrators to track resources, ensuring fairness and continuity. Knowledge became something that could be preserved beyond memory alone. Ritual life grew more elaborate alongside administration. The palace courtyard became a stage for communal ceremonies, processions, offerings, dances. These events reinforced unity, reminding participants that they were part of something larger than their village or family. The divine was present here too, not confined to inner sanctuaries, but woven into public life. Leadership during this time remains elusive to modern understanding. There is little evidence of a single king ruling with absolute authority. Instead, power seems to have been shared among elites, priests, and administrators, possibly guided by traditions that balanced influence rather than concentrating it. Women appear prominently in ritual imagery, suggesting ongoing respect for feminine authority and sacred roles. The palace did not replace the village. Instead, it connected villages, offering a focal point without erasing local identity. Life continued in fields, workshops, and homes much as before, but now with an added layer of coordination. The island functioned as a whole more smoothly, its parts linked through shared spaces and shared purpose. Yet even as Knossos rose, the island remained aware of its fragility. Earthquakes shook the ground without warning, cracking walls and scattering stored goods. The response was not abandonment, but rebuilding. Again and again. Each reconstruction incorporated lessons learned, refining techniques, strengthening foundations. Resilience was built into the system. By the time the first palace period reached its height, Crete had entered a new phase of existence. It was no longer a collection of villages alone, but a palace-centered society, organized, artistic, connected, and confident. And still, it remained open. There were no closed gates, no symbols of conquest. The sea continued to carry visitors and ideas, welcomed rather than feared. Knossos stood not as a monument to power, but as a living heart, beating steadily, coordinating movement, sustaining life across the island. And as people crossed its courtyards beneath open sky, unaware of how historians would one day name them, they were participating in one of the earliest and most distinctive experiments in civilization the ancient world would ever know. As the palaces of Crete settled into their place at the heart of island life, a quiet question began to take shape beneath the painted walls and open courtyards. Who guided this complex world? Who decided how grain was stored, when rituals were held, how labor was organized, and which paths goods would follow across land and sea? The answer even now remains gently elusive. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Minoans left no clear portraits of kings seated on thrones, no carved laws proclaiming authority, no heroic inscriptions celebrating conquest. Power in Minoan Crete did not announce itself loudly. It moved through corridors rather than standing upon platforms. It wore ritual robes more often than armor. Within the palace, authority appears to have been shared and layered. Administrators managed resources. Priests and priestesses guided ritual life. skilled officials oversaw craft production and trade. Leadership was present everywhere, yet nowhere did it feel absolute. Instead of a single ruler towering above all others, there seems to have been a balance, a web of influence woven carefully through social, religious, and economic life. At the center of this system stood the palace itself, not merely as a building, but as an idea. The palace was where the sacred and the practical met. Grain was measured there, but so were offerings. Decisions were made, but so were prayers. Authority flowed outward from this space, shaped as much by belief as by necessity. Art offers subtle clues. In frescoes and figurines, women appear frequently and prominently, often larger than surrounding figures, dressed in elaborate garments, arms raised in gesture or holding sacred symbols. These are not passive images. They suggest presence, command, and reverence. Many scholars believe that women held significant religious authority, perhaps even occupying the highest sacred roles within Minoan society. If there was a ruler in the conventional sense, that ruler may have been inseparable from ritual function. Leadership was likely justified not through lineage alone, but through closeness to the divine, the ability to mediate between human community and the living forces of nature. Power was sacred before it was political. The myth that would later emerge of King Minos, ruling from Knossos and judging souls after death, may echo distant memories of this system. Not a tyrant, but a lawgiver. Not a conqueror, but a figure of order and balance. Myth often distorts, but it also preserves emotional truth. In Minos, later Greeks may have sensed a different kind of authority. Firm, but not cruel. Structured, but not violent. The palace itself reinforced this idea through its design. Movement through its corridors was complex, winding yet purposeful. There were no straight lines leading directly to a throne room. Instead, spaces unfolded gradually, guiding visitors through light and shadow, open courts and narrow passages. Authority here was experienced, not displayed. This architectural complexity would later inspire the legend of the Labyrinth, a place of twists and turns, impossible to grasp all at once. But for the Minoans, such complexity was not meant to confuse or entrap. It reflected a worldview in which power was layered, contextual, and interconnected, rather than singular and absolute. Rituals reinforced this structure. Processions moved through the palace, carrying offerings of food, drink, and crafted objects. Music echoed softly, drums, flutes, rhythmic steps on stone. These ceremonies were not hidden behind closed doors. They unfolded in shared spaces, visible and participatory, binding the community together through repetition and meaning. Bull imagery appears again and again, powerful yet restrained. The bull was not merely an animal, but a symbol of strength, fertility, and the untamed forces of nature. Rituals involving bulls, including the famous bull leaping scenes, suggest not domination, but engagement. Human figures move alongside the animal, vaulting over it, touching it briefly, trusting timing and balance. It is a dance with power, not a conquest of it. This symbolism mirrors Minoan leadership itself. Authority did not crush the community beneath it. It moved with it, requiring skill, trust, and respect. Just as a bull leaper depended on rhythm and precision, so too did leaders depend on harmony between human effort and natural forces. There is little evidence of standing armies or warrior elites during this period. Weapons appear rarely in art, and fortifications remain minimal. This does not mean the Minoans were naive or defenseless, but rather that their power rested elsewhere, in trade networks, resource management, cultural influence, and internal stability. The sea played a role here as well. Control of trade routes brought wealth and connection without the need for constant warfare. Minoan ships carried goods and ideas across the Aegean, creating relationships that reinforced influence without bloodshed. Power travelled quietly, packed in jars of oil and wine, painted into pottery, woven into cloth. Within this system, law was likely customary rather than codified. Disputes were resolved through tradition, mediation, and communal memory. The palace served as an anchor for these processes, offering continuity rather than coercion. Justice was felt as balance restored, not punishment imposed. Even the gods of the Minoans reflect this gentle authority. Deities were rarely depicted as distant rulers. Instead, they were felt in caves, mountains, animals, and growth cycles. The divine world was intimate and immediate. To lead was to understand and honor these forces, not to command them. Children growing up in this society would have absorbed these values naturally. They watched rituals unfold, participated in seasonal festivals, learned their place within a wider pattern. Authority was visible, but it was woven into daily life rather than standing apart from it. Over time, this system created remarkable stability. Generations lived under the same rhythms, guided by shared beliefs and mutual dependence. The palaces endured, rebuilt after earthquakes, refined rather than replaced. Power adapted instead of collapsing. Yet this very subtlety would later make the Minoans vulnerable. A society built on balance rather than force relies on continuity and trust. When disruption came from nature, from outside influence, from shifting trade patterns, the system would be tested in ways no labyrinth, however carefully designed, could fully anticipate. For now, though, Crete rested within its web of sacred authority. Kings and queens, priests and administrators worked within a shared understanding of power as stewardship rather than domination. And beneath painted ceilings and open skies, the island continued its quiet experiment, a civilization guided not by fear, but by rhythm, ritual, and the enduring belief that harmony itself was the highest form of rule. Each morning, as light spread gently across the northern coast of Crete, the sea revealed itself not as an empty expanse, but as a living pathway. Harbours stirred with quiet preparation. Boats rocked softly against stone quays. Ropes creaked, sails were checked, and voices carried low across the water. For the Minoans, the sea was not something to be crossed only in moments of necessity. It was a familiar presence, a road that connected their island world to many others. From an early age, Cretans learned to read the water. They watched how its colour shifted with depth, how winds gathered along certain headlands, how clouds formed over distant horizons. Sailing was not reckless adventure, but practiced knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The sea rewarded patience and attentiveness, qualities deeply embedded in Minoan culture. Minoan ships were shaped for these waters. Long and narrow, built for stability and speed, they moved efficiently along coastlines and across open stretches when conditions allowed. Oars provided control in calm weather, while sails captured the steady winds of the Aegean. These vessels were not instruments of war, but of exchange. They carried goods, people, and ideas, binding Crete into a vast, fluid network. Trade did not flow in a single direction. From Crete travelled olive oil, wine, finely crafted pottery, textiles, and metalwork. These goods were valued not only for their usefulness, but for their distinctive style. Minoan craftsmanship carried an unmistakable elegance, flowing lines, balanced proportions, natural motifs that set it apart wherever it arrived. In return came raw materials and influences Crete lacked: copper and tin for bronze, ivory and precious stones, new artistic ideas, unfamiliar tools, and distant stories. These imports were not imposed upon Minoan society. They were absorbed, reshaped, and woven into existing traditions. The island learned from the world without losing its own voice. Harbour towns became lively points of connection. Zakros in the east, with its sheltered bay facing the Near East, felt the rhythms of distant lands. Goods arrived wrapped carefully, sealed with marks of origin. Languages mixed, gestures substituted for shared words. Trust was built slowly, through repeated exchanges and mutual benefit. Trade also reached inward. From coastal ports, goods moved along paths to palaces and inland communities. The palace system coordinated this flow, storing surplus, redistributing resources, and ensuring continuity. Wealth, in this sense, was not concentrated for display, but circulated to sustain the wider society. This circulation fostered stability. In years of poor harvest in one region, stored goods could compensate. In times of abundance, excess could be traded outward, strengthening external ties. The sea allowed the Minoans to smooth the uncertainties of island life, transforming vulnerability into resilience. Unlike later maritime powers, the Minoans did not seek domination of the sea through force. There is little evidence of naval battles or aggressive expansion. Their influence spread through familiarity rather than fear. Ports welcomed Minoan traders because trade with Crete brought beauty, quality, and reliability. Art again reflects this outlook. Frescoes depict ships not as weapons, but as graceful extensions of human effort. Crews work together, coordinated and calm. The sea appears alive but not hostile. Even distant shores are portrayed with curiosity rather than threat. This approach shaped how others perceived Crete. To mainland Greeks and island neighbours, the Minoans became known as skilled sailors and fair traders. Their presence brought connection rather than disruption. Over time, this reputation itself became a form of power, one built on trust and expectation. Wealth accumulated, but it did not manifest as rigid inequality. Luxury goods existed, yet they circulated within ritual and communal contexts. Finely worked objects appeared in palaces and sanctuaries, reinforcing shared identity rather than individual excess. Even high-status items were often dedicated to the divine, returned symbolically to the world that had provided them. The sea also carried intangible wealth. Ideas travelled with merchants and sailors. Artistic motifs, architectural concepts, and religious practices crossed waters quietly, leaving subtle traces. Crete influenced and was influenced in return, participating in a wider cultural conversation long before written history recorded it. Navigation itself became a source of confidence. Knowing the routes, the winds, the seasonal patterns of the sea, gave the Minoans a sense of belonging within a larger world. They were not isolated islanders, but participants in a living network that stretched far beyond sight of land. Children growing up near the coast would have watched ships depart and return, bringing unfamiliar objects and new faces. The horizon held promise rather than danger. The world beyond was something to engage with, not retreat from. This outward orientation reinforced the values already present within Minoan society: openness, adaptability, balance. Trade required negotiation, patience, and trust. These qualities shape not only external relations, but internal ones as well. The same principles that guided exchange across the sea guided cooperation within the island. Over time, the wealth generated by trade supported further artistic and architectural development. Palaces expanded, frescoes multiplied, crafts reached new levels of refinement. Yet even as material culture flourished, it remained tied to natural rhythms and communal meaning. The sea never became invisible or taken for granted. Storms still disrupted journeys. Ships were lost. Lives ended. But these risks were accepted as part of the relationship. The sea gave generously, but it demanded respect. As evening fell over the harbours, ships settled into still water. Sails were lowered. Cargo was unloaded. Voices softened. The day's movement gave way to rest, and beyond the fading light, the sea waited, patient, open, ready to carry the Minoans onward once more, along the road that had quietly made their island one of the most connected places in the ancient world. If one could step quietly into a Minoan palace during its fullest days, what might stand out most is not the scale of the building, nor the wealth stored within its rooms, but the feeling of movement and colour everywhere. Walls did not stand silent. Floors were not merely surfaces to walk upon. Clothing, vessels, and everyday objects all seemed to participate in a shared language of beauty that flowed through daily life as naturally as breath. Art in Minoan Crete was not reserved for distant temples or the glorification of rulers. It lived among the people. It surrounded work, ritual, and rest alike. To be Minoan was to move through a world shaped deliberately to please the eye and calm the spirit. Frescoes covered palace walls with scenes that felt alive even in stillness. Dolphins leapt across deep blue seas. Birds hovered among reeds and lilies. Human figures danced, processed, and leapt with bodies caught mid-motion. There was little stiffness, little symmetry imposed for its own sake. Instead, forms curved and stretched, suggesting a world always in motion. These images did not tell stories of war or domination. They did not celebrate victories over enemies or the suffering of the defeated. Instead, they returned again and again to nature, ritual, and shared experience. Art was not propaganda, it was affirmation, a visual reminder of how the Minoans understood their place in the world. Colour played a central role. Reds, blues, whites, yellows, and blacks were used boldly, yet harmoniously. The palette was vibrant without being harsh. These colours echoed the environment: the blue of the sea, the red-brown of earth and clay, the white of limestone and foam. Even interior spaces felt open and connected to the outside world through light and hue. Clothing, too, reflected this aesthetic. Minoan garments were carefully crafted and expressive. Flowing skirts, fitted bodices, and layered textiles moved with the body rather than constraining it. Fabrics were often decorated with patterns, borders, and colours that mirrored those found in frescoes and pottery. Dress was not merely practical, it was a form of participation in the cultural rhythm. Jewellery added subtle brilliance. Gold, beads, and carved stones adorned necks, wrists, and hair. These items were finely made, delicate rather than heavy, suggesting appreciation for detail. rather than excess. Even personal adornment reflected balance and restraint. Daily life unfolded within this visual world. In homes and workshops, pottery filled shelves and floors, jars for storage, cups for drinking, bowls for food. Each vessel carried signs of care: smooth surfaces, balanced proportions, thoughtful decoration. Even the most ordinary object was shaped with intention. Work itself became a quiet form of art. Potters shaped clay with practiced hands, guided by memory and touch. Weavers transformed raw fibers into patterned cloth, their movements rhythmic and precise. Metalworkers crafted tools and ornaments, balancing function with form. These skills were not isolated professions, but respected contributions to communal life. Children grew up surrounded by this beauty. From an early age, they learned to recognize patterns, colors, and motifs. They watched adults create, repair, and decorate. Artistic knowledge passed naturally from generation to generation, woven into daily routine rather than taught as separate discipline. Music likely accompanied many activities. Though the instruments themselves are mostly lost, images and artifacts suggest drums, flutes, and rhythmic movement. Sound, like color, shaped experience. Festivals, rituals, and gatherings would have been rich with coordinated motion and music, reinforcing social bonds through shared sensory experience. Food preparation and dining also reflected aesthetic values. Meals were communal, shared from carefully crafted vessels. Oil glistened on bread. Wine caught the light in painted cups. Eating was not rushed. It was another opportunity for connection, conversation, and gratitude for the island's generosity. The Minoans' love of beauty did not imply idleness or excess. Work was constant. Fields required tending. Ships needed repair. Goods had to be stored and transported. Yet beauty softened labor. It reminded people that effort was part of a larger rhythm, one that included rest, celebration, and reflection. Nature remained the ultimate source of inspiration. Plants, animals, and landscapes appeared everywhere in Minoan art, not as symbols to be dominated, but as companions. Even powerful creatures like bulls were depicted with respect and vitality rather than menace. The human figure, too, was shown in harmony with its surroundings, rarely isolated or exaggerated. This artistic worldview reinforced the values that had shaped Minoan society from its earliest days: balance, movement, openness, and respect for life. Beauty was not superficial. It was structural. It supported emotional well-being and social cohesion, creating environments where cooperation felt natural. Visitors from other lands would have noticed this immediately. To step into a Minoan space was to enter a world that felt different, lighter, more fluid, less rigid. This impression lingered, carried back across the sea, along with traded goods and stories. Crete's influence spread not only through commerce, but through the quiet power of example. Yet art was never static. Styles evolved, new motifs appeared, external influences were absorbed and transformed. Minoan creativity remained flexible, open to change without losing its core identity. This adaptability would serve the civilization well in times of growth, and challenge it in times of strain. As evening settled over palace and village alike, colours softened. Shadows stretched across painted walls. Lamps flickered, reflecting off polished surfaces. The day's movement slowed, but beauty remained present, woven into every surface and gesture. In this world, art was not something to be visited. It was something to live within. And as the Minoans continued to refine their skills, expand their connections, and deepen their rituals, this devotion to beauty would remain one of their most enduring legacies, a quiet testament to a civilization that chose harmony over display and expression over force as it moved steadily forward through time. To understand the Minoans, one must step gently into their sacred world, a world without towering temples or distant judgmental gods carved in stone. The divine in Crete did not sit apart from daily life. It breathed through caves and mountain tops, stirred in the sea wind, and revealed itself in the turning of seasons. For the Minoans, the sacred was not something to approach with fear, but something already present, quietly surrounding them. Unlike many ancient cultures, the Minoans left no clear images of gods with fixed faces and names. There were no grand statues declaring absolute authority, no myths carved into stone to enforce obedience. Instead, the divine appeared fluid, shifting, and deeply connected to nature. Power was felt, not defined. Sacred spaces reflected this understanding. Caves, cool and echoing, drew worshippers inward, toward the earth's hidden depths. Mountain peaks lifted ritual upward, offering wide views and open sky. These were not chosen at random. They were places where the natural world felt especially alive, where silence carried weight and presence could be sensed rather than seen. Within villages and palaces, smaller shrines echoed this connection. Simple altars, horns of consecration, and sacred symbols marked places of offering and reflection. These spaces did not separate sacred from ordinary life. They blended into it. A ritual might follow a harvest, a journey, or a moment of uncertainty, woven naturally into daily routine. The central figure of Minoan religion appears again and again in art and figurines. A powerful female presence, often associated with animals, plants, and movement. Sometimes she stands with arms raised. Sometimes she holds snakes, creatures of renewal and transformation. Sometimes she appears amid nature itself, indistinguishable from it. This figure is often referred to as a goddess, but such a word may not fully capture her role. She was not a distant ruler of the cosmos. She embodied cycles, growth and decay, birth and return, movement and stillness. She was life experienced rather than commanded. The prominence of this sacred feminine presence suggests a worldview centered on balance and continuity. Fertility was not limited to human reproduction. It extended to land, animals, and the sea. Renewal was constant, even in moments of loss. Death was not an ending, but a transformation within a larger pattern. Rituals reflected this outlook. Offerings were often organic: food, drink, crafted objects, small figurines. These were not sacrifices of destruction, but acts of exchange and gratitude. Something was given back to the forces that sustained life, reinforcing a relationship rather than appeasing a threat. Processions moved slowly through palace courtyards and open spaces. Participants carried offerings, danced, and sang. Music and movement mattered as much as words. Ritual was experienced through the body, grounding belief in physical presence rather than abstract doctrine. Animal symbolism played a key role. Bulls represented vitality and strength. Birds suggested movement between worlds. Snakes symbolized renewal, shedding old skins for new life. These creatures were not worshipped as gods themselves, but respected as expressions of natural power. The famous bull-leaping scenes, so central to Minoan imagery, may have held ritual significance. These acts required trust, precision, and courage. They were not about domination, but about engagement, a momentary meeting between human and animal, life and risk, order and chaos. In this dance, balance was everything. There is little evidence of fear-based religion in Crete. No images of divine punishment. No emphasis on eternal judgment. Instead, ritual emphasized participation and harmony. The goal was not salvation from sin, but alignment with the rhythms of the world. This outlook shaped social values. Authority was sacred because it maintained balance, not because it enforced obedience. Leaders likely held religious roles, guiding ceremonies and preserving tradition. Women in particular seem to have been central to ritual life, reinforcing their visible presence in art and ceremony. Children would have grown up within this sacred rhythm. They learned rituals by participating in them, absorbing meaning through repetition rather than instruction. The divine was not something explained, but something felt. In the warmth of the sun, the sound of drums, the smell of offerings burning softly. The absence of written theology allowed belief to remain flexible. Practices could adapt to new circumstances without conflict. Local variations existed, yet they did not fracture shared identity. The sacred feminine, the cycles of nature, and the importance of balance formed a common thread across the island. Even the architecture of palaces echoed this spirituality. Open courtyards allowed rituals beneath the sky. Light wells connected interior spaces to sun and air. There was no sharp boundary between sacred and secular. Every space held potential meaning. This closeness between ritual and life fostered emotional security. People were not constantly striving to please distant gods. They lived within a sacred world, already accepting them. Gratitude replaced fear. Participation replaced submission. Yet this gentle spirituality also depended on stability. When seasons changed predictably, when trade flowed, when communities thrived, balance felt natural. The sacred order seemed self-sustaining. But when disruption came, from earth, sea, or outside influence, this worldview would be tested. For now, though, Crete rested within a sacred landscape that felt intimate and alive. Gods had no fixed faces because they did not need them. Divinity moved through earth and water, body and breath. And as the Minoans gathered in caves and courtyards, under mountain sky and open sun, they practiced a form of belief that asked not for conquest or fear, but for attention, respect, and quiet participation in the endless turning of life itself. As Minoan society grew more complex, as goods moved steadily between villages, palaces, and distant shores, memory alone was no longer enough. The rhythms of life were still guided by tradition and spoken word, but the web of exchange had become too intricate to rely entirely on recall. Grain was stored in vast quantities. Oil flowed in and out of palace storerooms. Crafts were produced, counted, and distributed. Somewhere within this growing need for coordination, the Minoans did something quietly remarkable. They began to write, not stories, not prayers, not laws carved for eternity, but marks, signs, simple impressions pressed into clay while it was still soft, intended to last just long enough to serve their purpose. This was not writing meant to be heard. It was writing meant to function. Today, this system is known as Linear A. a script that remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. It speaks to us through fragments and patterns, yet refuses to reveal its voice. We can see its structure, its repetition, its careful order, but not its meaning. Linear A appeared primarily in palace contexts. It was used to record transactions, inventories, and distributions. Clay tablets, nodules, and ceilings were marked with symbols representing quantities and goods. Once the information was no longer needed, the tablets were often discarded. Their survival was accidental, preserved by fire and collapse rather than intention. This alone tells us much. Writing in Minoan Crete was practical, not monumental. It did not exist to glorify rulers or preserve epic memory. It existed to support balance and continuity. It was a tool of coordination, quietly woven into daily administration. The people who used Linear A were trained specialists. Scribes worked within palace systems, carefully recording movement of resources. Their work required precision, consistency, and trust. A mistake could ripple outward, affecting many lives. Writing here was not power displayed, it was responsibility carried. Unlike later scripts, Linear A does not dominate visual space. It is small, orderly, almost modest. Symbols flow in neat rows, balanced and calm. Even without understanding the words, one senses intention rather than urgency. This script reflects the society that created it, measured, functional, and deeply integrated into cooperative systems. Seals played an important role alongside writing. Carved from stone or ivory, they bore unique designs and were pressed into clay to mark ownership, approval, or responsibility. A seal impression carried authority, but again, not in an aggressive sense. It was a sign of trust, a promise that what was recorded had been overseen and accepted. These seals often featured animals, nature motifs, or abstract designs rather than portraits of individuals. Identity was expressed symbolically rather than personally. Authority remained tied to role and function, not individual dominance. Linear A likely recorded the Minoan language itself, a language now lost to time. We can see that the script includes syllabic signs and ideograms, suggesting a sophisticated system capable of nuance. And yet, it remains silent. No bilingual texts survive. No Rosetta Stone waits to unlock its meaning. This silence has an emotional weight. We can trace Minoan trade routes, admire their art, reconstruct their buildings, but we cannot hear their words. We cannot read their prayers, their names, their private thoughts. Their voice has faded, leaving only the echo of structure behind. And perhaps that is fitting. The Minoans did not center their identity on written declaration. They lived through movement, ritual, and shared experience. Writing supported life, but did not define it. Meaning was carried in bodies, landscapes, and repeated actions rather than preserved in text. This reliance on memory and ritual may explain why Linear A was never adapted for storytelling or myth. Stories lived in performance, not on tablets. Knowledge passed through voice, gesture, and participation. Writing remained a quiet servant, not a master. When disasters struck, earthquakes, fires, eventual decline, writing did not save the system. Clay tablets hardened in flames, preserving records no longer needed, while the living networks they served were disrupted. Writing endured only because life around it faltered. Later, when Mycenaean Greeks came to dominate Crete, they adapted parts of this system into Linear B, a script used to write an early form of Greek. Linear B can be read. It tells us of kings, warriors, weapons, and strict hierarchies. Through comparison, the contrast becomes clear. Where Linear B speaks loudly of control, Linear A remains quiet, administrative, and restrained. Where later societies used writing to assert power, the Minoans used it to maintain balance. This difference matters. It suggests that Minoan civilization did not see permanence as something achieved through inscription. Their world was sustained through renewal, not preservation. Writing was temporary, like the clay it was pressed into, meant to serve the moment and then return to earth. Still, these silent signs connect us across millennia. Each mark was made by a human hand, guided by thought and intention. Someone pressed that symbol, counted that jar, approved that exchange. Someone trusted the system to work. As we look at Linear A today, we are not just confronting an undeciphered script. We are encountering a different relationship to knowledge, one that valued function over proclamation, continuity over legacy. The words are gone. The meaning slips away whenever we try to grasp it. And yet, in this silence, the Minoans remain strangely present, reminding us that not all civilizations sought to be heard forever, and that some, content to live well in their own time, allowed their voices to fade gently into history, leaving behind only the quiet order of marks pressed once into clay and then released back into the turning world. When scholars first began uncovering the palaces of Crete, one question rose again and again from the stone and soil. Where are the walls? In an age when many ancient societies surrounded themselves with fortifications, moats, and watchtowers, the Minoan world seemed strangely open. Palaces stood without massive defensive barriers. Cities lacked thick ramparts. Weapons appeared rarely in art. From this absence grew a powerful idea, that the Minoans were a peaceful people living largely without war. But peace, like all human conditions, is rarely absolute. To understand Minoan defense, one must let go of modern assumptions. Security did not always mean walls and armies. For Crete, safety may have rested in geography, diplomacy, and reputation as much as in force. The island itself offered protection. Surrounded by water, with few easy landing points, Crete was naturally shielded from sudden attack. Any approaching ship could be seen long before it reached shore. The sea, which served as a road for trade, also acted as a buffer. Control of maritime routes allowed the Minoans to anticipate movement, maintain alliances, and discourage aggression. Their ships were known, their ports familiar. An enemy would not arrive unnoticed or unchallenged by the rhythms of exchange already in place. Within the island, mountains created natural divisions. Narrow passes and rugged terrain made large-scale invasion difficult. Communities were spread across valleys and coasts, connected but not concentrated in a single vulnerable point. This dispersed settlement pattern reduced the impact of any localized conflict. Art reinforces this impression of relative calm. Frescoes celebrate nature, ritual, and movement, not battle. Figures are rarely armed. Scenes of violence are almost entirely absent. This silence is striking, especially when compared to the war-heavy imagery of later Mycenaean Greece. Weapons do exist in the archaeological record: daggers, spearheads, blades, but they are limited and often finely crafted, suggesting ceremonial or status roles as much as practical ones. There is little evidence of large standing armies or a warrior elite dominating society. Power, as we have seen, flowed through administration and ritual rather than military command. This does not mean the Minoans were defenseless or naive. Conflict likely occurred, as it does in all human societies. Disputes over resources, trade disagreements, internal tensions, these would have existed. But conflict does not seem to have been the defining feature of Minoan life or identity. Instead of walls, the Minoans invested in relationships. Trade created mutual dependence, cultural exchange fostered familiarity, reputation acted as deterrent. To attack Crete was to disrupt a network that benefited many. Peace was maintained not by fear of retaliation alone, but by shared interest in continuity. Even the palaces themselves suggest this outlook. Their openness was not careless. It reflected confidence. Confidence in systems, in alliances, in balance. Courtyards were open because life was meant to be visible and shared. Authority was exercised in daylight, not hidden behind fortifications. Some scholars have suggested that the Minoans relied on naval power for defense, not necessarily aggressive fleets, but the ability to control sea lanes and respond quickly to threats. A well-organized maritime society could deter attack simply by being prepared and connected. There is also the possibility that Minoan security relied on ritual and belief. Sacred authority may have reinforced social cohesion, discouraging internal violence. When power is seen as sacred stewardship rather than domination, conflict within society can be softened if not eliminated. Yet, cracks appear over time. In later phases of Minoan history, fortifications begin to appear at some sites. Weapons become slightly more common. These changes suggest shifting conditions, increased pressure from outside forces, internal strain, or both. Peace, it seems, was not a permanent state, but an achievement that required favorable circumstances. The question, then, is not whether the Minoans were peaceful, but how they defined strength. Their civilization did not measure power primarily through conquest or intimidation. It measured it through stability, prosperity, and cultural influence. For centuries, this approach worked. Their influence spread across the Aegean without armies marching behind it. Their art shaped neighboring cultures. Their trade networks connected distant lands. Their reputation traveled faster than any fleet. But such a system depends on balance, environmental stability, reliable trade, mutual respect among neighbors. When these conditions falter, a society built on openness becomes vulnerable. Peace without preparation can invite disruption, even if violence is not sought. As the Minoans moved deeper into the later stages of their civilization, subtle changes hinted at challenges ahead. External powers were rising, trade patterns shifted, new societies valued military strength more openly. The Aegean world was changing. For now, though, Crete remained largely unfortified, its palaces open to light and movement, its people guided by systems that valued cooperation over conflict. Whether by choice, circumstance, or belief, the Minoans charted a different path through the ancient world, one where power did not always wear armor, and where the absence of walls spoke not of weakness, but of a long-standing confidence in balance, connection, and the quiet strength of a civilization at ease with itself. The ground beneath Crete was never entirely still. Long before palaces rose and courtyards filled with movement, the island had been shaped by forces far older and stronger than human intention. Mountains lifted themselves slowly from the sea. Valleys split and folded. Beneath the beauty of sunlit hills and fertile plains, the earth carried a quiet tension, one that the Minoans knew well, even if they could never predict it. Earthquakes were a fact of life on Crete. They did not arrive with warning or pattern. A calm morning could fracture without sound, the ground shuddering suddenly beneath bare feet. Walls cracked, jars toppled, stone shifted against stone. In moments like these, the island reminded its people that stability was always temporary, a gift rather than a guarantee. Archaeological layers across Crete reveal this truth again and again. Palaces show signs of collapse and repair, not once but repeatedly. Floors buckled, columns fell. Entire wings of buildings were damaged or destroyed. And yet, what follows each layer of destruction is not abandonment, but rebuilding. This cycle shaped the Minoan mindset deeply. Rather than seeing earthquakes as punishment or failure, the Minoans seem to have accepted them as part of the island's nature. Crete gave generously, but it also moved beneath their feet. The response was adaptation rather than despair. Walls were rebuilt stronger. Foundations were adjusted. Architectural techniques evolved, incorporating flexibility and resilience. Wooden beams were embedded within stone walls to absorb shock. Columns were designed to taper downward, wider at the top than the base, distributing weight in ways that modern observers still find striking. Buildings spread outward rather than upward, reducing catastrophic collapse. These choices were not accidental. They were learned through experience. The palaces themselves bear witness to this learning. Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, each was rebuilt multiple times, often on the same footprint. The layout remained familiar, preserving memory and continuity, even as details changed. To rebuild was not to erase the past, but to honor it. Earthquakes also carried symbolic weight. When the ground moved, it blurred the boundary between human order and natural power. No amount of planning could fully control the earth. This may have reinforced the Minoan emphasis on humility, balance, and reverence for unseen forces. Nature was not an enemy, but a partner whose moods had to be respected. Ritual likely followed disaster. Offerings placed in damaged shrines. Ceremonies held to restore harmony. Communities gathered not only to rebuild structures, but to restore confidence and meaning. In these moments, the palace became more than an administrative center. It became a symbol of resilience, proof that life continued. The economic impact of earthquakes was significant. Storerooms could be lost, trade disrupted, labor redirected from production to repair. And yet, the palace system allowed resources to be redistributed, easing recovery. Surplus stored in one region could support another. Networks softened the blow of local disaster. This resilience fostered trust in the system. People rebuilt because they believed rebuilding mattered. The palace was not an abstract authority. It was a shared investment, worth restoring again and again. Still, each earthquake left subtle scars. Even when repaired, buildings carried traces of damage. Repeated destruction required energy, time, and coordination. Over centuries, these disruptions accumulated, placing quiet strain on the system. There is evidence that some earthquakes coincided with broader periods of instability. Damage patterns suggest that seismic events may have contributed to shifts in power between palaces or changes in administrative structure. A damaged center could lose influence, allowing others to rise. Nature, once again, shaped human affairs without intention. The emotional experience of earthquakes must not be overlooked. For those who lived through them, the memory of shaking ground would linger. Children would grow up hearing stories of walls falling and earth roaring beneath the sky. Such memories reinforce awareness of fragility, a reminder that even the most beautiful spaces could vanish in moments. Yet fear did not define the Minoan response. There is no evidence of widespread abandonment following earthquakes. Life resumed, art continued, trade recovered, ritual persisted. The island did not retreat inward or harden itself against the world. Instead, earthquakes may have deepened the Minoans' acceptance of impermanence. Their buildings, like their writing, were not meant to last forever unchanged. Renewal was expected. Continuity did not require permanence, only repetition and care. This outlook gave strength, but it also carried risk. A society comfortable with rebuilding may underestimate cumulative strain. One disaster can be absorbed. Many, layered over time, can erode even the most resilient system. As Crete moved toward the later phases of its history, earthquakes would intersect with other pressures: environmental change, shifting trade networks, and the growing presence of outside powers. What had once been manageable disruptions would begin to align with larger transformations. For now, though, the palaces still stood. Columns were reset, frescoes repainted, courtyards reopened beneath open sky. The earth had shaken, but life had not stopped. Each rebuilding was an act of faith, not faith that disaster would never return, but faith that balance could be restored again and again. In this way, the trembling ground became part of the Minoan story, shaping a civilization that understood fragility not as weakness, but as a condition of living closely with the powerful, shifting world beneath their feet. For generations, the world of the Minoans had endured through patience and renewal. Earthquakes shook the ground, yet walls were rebuilt. Trade shifted, yet routes adapted. Ritual and rhythm restored balance again and again. But some forces moved beyond the reach of human response, vast, sudden, and irrevocable. And one day, far to the north of Crete, the sea itself became the messenger of such a force. On the island we now call Thera, modern Santorini, the earth had been stirring. Beneath its cliffs and quiet settlements, pressure gathered slowly, invisibly. For years, perhaps decades, the land gave subtle warnings: tremors, shifting ground, changes in the sea. Those who lived there may have sensed unease, but like all island peoples, they were accustomed to the moods of earth and water. Then, the sky broke open. The eruption of Thera was one of the most powerful natural events the ancient Mediterranean would ever witness. When it came, it did not arrive gently. The island tore itself apart in a thunder that echoed across the sea. Ash rose into the sky, blotting out the sun. Fire and stone were hurled outward. The centre of the island collapsed, leaving behind a vast flooded crater. For those nearby, time must have seemed to stop. The eruption sent shockwaves through the Aegean. Tsunamis raced outward, driven by collapsing land and violent displacement of water. Walls of sea surged toward distant shores. Ash drifted on the wind, carried far beyond the horizon. The familiar world darkened, if only briefly, beneath falling dust. Crete lay south of Thera, separated by open water, not close enough to be destroyed outright, but not distant enough to remain untouched. Along the northern coast, waves may have struck harbours with sudden force. Ships were smashed or swept inland. Coastal settlements suffered damage, some severe. Ports that had long served as gateways of trade became points of vulnerability. The sea road that had sustained Minoan wealth turned for a moment into a path of devastation. Ash settled over fields. Crops were damaged. Soil was altered. The sun may have dimmed for a season, disrupting growing cycles and unsettling familiar rhythms. Even those far from the coast would have felt the change. The air tasting different, the sky unfamiliar. Archaeology suggests that Crete survived the immediate impact. Palaces were not buried beneath ash, as Thera was. Life continued. Walls were repaired. Art persisted. Ritual resumed. But survival is not the same as recovery. The eruption did not end the Minoan world in a single moment. Instead, it introduced instability into a system that depended on balance. Trade networks were disrupted. Ships were lost. Ports damaged. Connections that had taken generations to build were suddenly fragile. The psychological impact may have been just as profound. The Minoans had long lived with earthquakes, but volcanic destruction on this scale was something different entirely. Fire from the sea challenged the familiar relationship between land and water. The divine forces they honoured suddenly felt less predictable, less gentle. Rituals may have intensified in response. Offerings increased. Ceremonies sought to restore harmony. But the sense of invulnerability, the quiet confidence that Crete's balance would always return, may have been shaken. Economic strain followed. Loss of ships meant loss of trade. Loss of trade meant loss of surplus. The palace system, so effective in times of relative stability, faced new pressure. Redistribution could soften the blow, but only for so long. Rebuilding harbours and fleets required resources, coordination, and time. At the same time, the wider Aegean world was changing. Mainland societies, particularly the Mycenaeans, were growing stronger, more militarized, more accustomed to hierarchy and force. As Minoan influence wavered, others watched. The eruption of Thera did not create these external pressures, but it exposed them. A society built on openness and exchange becomes vulnerable when its connections are disrupted. The sea, once a source of wealth and security, could no longer be relied upon in the same way. Some palaces show signs of decline after this period. Destruction layers appear. Rebuilding becomes uneven. Administrative systems strain. Writing practices change. The long continuity that had defined Minoan life begins to fracture. It is important to remember that this was not a sudden collapse into chaos. People still lived, worked, and worshipped. Children were born. Fields were planted. Art did not disappear overnight. But something essential had shifted. Confidence gave way to caution. Renewal became more difficult. The eruption also altered memory. Stories of fire, darkness, and sea may have been passed down, reshaped into myth. Later Greek legends of Atlantis, a powerful island swallowed by the sea, echo faintly with the memory of Thera, filtered through generations of retelling. For the Minoans themselves, the eruption marked a turning point. The world they had known, stable enough to rebuild endlessly, open enough to trust in balance, was no longer guaranteed. Their response was not panic, but adaptation. Yet adaptation has limits. Over the following decades, Crete would face further challenges. Earthquakes continued. Trade networks shifted permanently. Outside influence grew stronger. The palace system, once the quiet heart of Minoan life, would struggle to maintain its role. In hindsight, it is tempting to see the eruption as the beginning of the end. But for those living through it, the future was not yet written. They did not know they stood at a threshold. They only knew that the sea had changed, the sky had darkened, and the rhythms they trusted now required more effort to sustain. As ash settled and waters calmed, the Minoans returned to their work. Ships were rebuilt where possible. Rituals sought reassurance. Life continued, quieter and more uncertain than before. Fire from the sea had passed, but it left behind more than broken stone and altered shores. It left a question hanging in the air, whether the balance that had guided Crete for centuries could still be restored, or whether the island had begun, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to drift toward a different fate, carried by forces far beyond human design. In the years that followed the great disruption from the north, Crete remained inhabited, cultivated, and alive, but it was no longer alone in shaping its destiny. Across the sea, on the Greek mainland, a different kind of society was rising, one that understood power in more rigid, more martial terms. These were the Mycenaeans, and as the balance of the Aegean shifted, their presence began to press softly, then steadily, against the world the Minoans had built. At first, the change was subtle. Trade contacts increased. Mainland goods appeared more frequently in Cretan contexts. Pottery styles shifted. New forms and decorations mixed with traditional Minoan designs. These were not signs of invasion, but of growing influence, a blending of cultures that often precedes more decisive change. The Mycenaeans admired Crete. They sought its craftsmanship, its maritime knowledge, its prestige. For generations, Minoan culture had been the model to which others looked, but admiration does not always remain equal. As Minoan networks weakened after the eruption of Thera, the balance of exchange began to tilt. Mycenaean society was more overtly hierarchical. Their art celebrated warriors, weapons, and conquest. Fortified citadels crowned hills. Authority was concentrated, expressed through kingship and military power. Where the Minoans favoured openness and ritual balance, the Mycenaeans favoured control and defence. These differences mattered. As Mycenaean traders, officials, and perhaps settlers arrived in greater numbers, they brought with them new assumptions about order and leadership. The palace, once a space of shared administration and ritual, began to change in character. Writing practices shifted as Linear B, adapted from Minoan systems, appeared in Cretan contexts. This new script recorded a Greek language and a more rigid bureaucratic hierarchy. The presence of Linear B marks a profound transition. Where Linear A had quietly served balance, Linear B spoke clearly of ownership, authority, and command. It listed warriors, chariots, weapons, and officials. The tone of administration hardened. Archaeological evidence suggests that some palaces were destroyed during this period, whether by conflict, internal unrest, or opportunistic takeover remains uncertain. Knossos, however, appears to have survived. Not as a purely Minoan centre, but as a Mycenaean-administered one. The heart of Crete continued to beat, but to a different rhythm. This transition was likely uneven and complex. Not all Minoans disappeared. Many remained, adapting to new leadership and systems. Cultural practices blended, rituals persisted, though perhaps reshaped. Daily life continued, even as the structures guiding it changed. For those living through this time, the shift may not have felt like conquest, but like gradual displacement. familiar rhythms altered. Decisions were made differently. Authority felt more distant, more directive. The subtle, shared stewardship that had defined Minoan power gave way to clearer lines of command. The sea, once Crete's greatest strength, now carried different ships. Mycenaean fleets moved confidently across the Aegean, supported by fortified harbours and organised military power. Trade became more controlled. Influence flowed increasingly from the mainland outward. Art reflects this transformation. Imagery grows more rigid, less fluid. Motifs of nature give way to symbols of status and power. The easy movement of earlier frescoes fades, replaced by formality and repetition. Yet traces of Minoan identity endured. Techniques, aesthetics, and spiritual ideas continue to shape the Aegean world through Mycenaean adaptation. The Minoans did not vanish. They were absorbed, their legacy carried forward in altered form. This process, however, was not without loss. A civilization built on openness and balance struggled under systems that valued hierarchy and force. What had once been flexible became constrained. What had once flowed now followed stricter paths. Over time, the distinctiveness of Minoan culture faded. The palaces no longer functioned as they once had. Ritual centres lost prominence. The language of Crete was no longer written. Memory shifted from lived practice to distant echo. And yet, even in this fading, the Minoans influenced the future. Mycenaean Greece, and later classical Greece, inherited elements of Minoan art, myth, and worldview. The labyrinth, the bull, the sea. These symbols endured, reshaped but not erased. The arrival of the Mycenaeans did not end life on Crete in a single moment. It marked a transition from independence to integration, from quiet balance to visible power. The shadow that fell across the island was long, but it did not erase everything beneath it. As mainland voices grew louder in palace halls once filled with flowing frescoes and ritual music, the Minoan world receded into memory. Its people continued to live, work, and believe, even as the systems that had guided them for centuries slipped away. The strangers from the mainland did not come only with swords and commands. They came with a different way of understanding the world. And as that understanding took root, the age of the Minoans, not suddenly, but slowly and irrevocably, began to give way to something new, carried forward on the same sea that had once made Crete the quiet centre of the ancient world. The end of the Minoan world did not arrive with a single catastrophe, nor did it announce itself with fire and conquest across the whole island. Instead, it unfolded slowly, unevenly, and quietly, like twilight spreading across familiar ground. By the time the last palaces fell, much had already changed, though life itself continued much as it always had, at least on the surface. The palaces, once the living hearts of Minoan society, began to lose their rhythm. Some were damaged beyond repair. Others were abandoned gradually, their courtyards growing silent, their storerooms emptied or repurposed. Knossos lingered the longest, sustained under Mycenaean administration. But even there the character of the place had shifted. What remained was structure without spirit, form without the worldview that had once animated it. Archaeological layers tell a story of final disruption. Fires swept through certain palace complexes. Administrative systems ceased. Writing in Linear A disappeared entirely, replaced briefly by Linear B, and then by silence. The careful coordination that had bound villages, trade, ritual, and authority together, unraveled, thread by thread. Yet there is little evidence of widespread slaughter or sudden collapse. People did not vanish. Instead, they adapted. Again, settlements shifted location. Life moved away from large centralized spaces towards smaller, more defensible communities. Hilltop sites became more common, reflecting a world that now felt less secure, more uncertain. The openness that had once defined Minoan life faded. Where palaces had stood open to light and movement, later communities favoured enclosure and caution. The landscape itself seemed to withdraw, echoing the internal change of the society living upon it. Trade, once Crete's lifeblood, diminished. The island was no longer the central hub of the Aegean. Routes shifted toward the mainland. Goods arrived less frequently. Wealth, no longer circulating through palace systems, became localized and limited. Without the sea acting as a reliable road, Crete turned inward. Ritual life changed as well. The great communal ceremonies of palace courtyards faded. Sacred caves and peak sanctuaries continued to hold meaning, but their role in daily life narrowed. Spiritual practice became more private, more localized, less visibly integrated into shared civic identity. Art followed this contraction. The flowing frescoes disappeared. Pottery became simpler, more functional. Beauty did not vanish, but it no longer defined public space. Creativity survived in quieter forms, stripped of the abundance that palace wealth had once supported. The Minoan language, already silent in writing, faded from speech as well. Over generations, Greek dialects replaced it. Names changed. Stories shifted. Memory thinned. What had once been a distinct cultural voice blended into the wider Aegean world. For those living through this transition, there was no sense of finality. No one woke one morning knowing they were witnessing the end of an age. Parents raised children. Fields were planted. Animals were tended. The island remained beautiful. The sea still moved. The mountains still held their silence. And yet, something essential had gone. The systems that had allowed the Minoans to live without walls, to trust in balance, to lead through ritual rather than force, no longer functioned in the same way. The world around Crete had grown harsher, more competitive. Openness became risk. Balance required protection. What faded was not just political control, but a way of seeing the world, a belief that harmony could be maintained through cooperation alone, a confidence that renewal would always be possible. The Minoans had lived by these ideas for centuries, and they had served them well, until conditions changed beyond what renewal alone could address. The palaces, once rebuilt after every earthquake, were not rebuilt this time. Their stones remained where they fell, slowly reclaimed by earth and vegetation. Paths grew over. Silence settled. Yet even in this fading, the Minoans did not truly disappear. Their influence lingered in myths, in artistic forms, in shared symbols carried forward by those who came after. The labyrinth endured as story. The bull remained powerful. The sea continued to shape identity. Crete itself remembered. As centuries passed, new peoples walked among the ruins, often unaware of the full lives once lived there. Stones that had echoed with music and ceremony became foundations for later dwellings. History layered itself gently, one world resting atop another. The end of the Minoan civilization was not a fall into darkness. It was a quiet closing, a civilization loosening its hold, allowing itself to be absorbed into the broader flow of time. What remained was not empire but legacy. And in the stillness of abandoned courtyards, beneath broken columns open once more to the sky, one can almost sense the final echo of that older rhythm, a world that rose without conquest, flourished through balance, and faded without fury, leaving behind not a tale of ruin, but a long, soft memory carried forward into the deep sleep of history. Long after the last palaces fell quiet, long after painted walls crumbled back into earth, the Minoans did not vanish completely. They survived in another form, not in stone or writing, but in story. As generations passed and new peoples shaped the Aegean world, memories of Crete drifted outward, carried by sailors, poets, and rumour. What had once been lived experience slowly transformed into myth. And myth, though altered by time, remembers what history cannot always explain. To the Greeks who came later, Crete was never just an island. It was a place of origins, of ancient authority, of mysteries older than their own cities. At the centre of these stories stood a figure called Minos, king, lawgiver, judge of the dead. In him, echoes of Minoan sacred authority survived, reshaped to fit a new world view. Minos ruled not through chaos, but through order. He received laws from the gods. He governed with certainty. Even after death, he judged souls. This image may reflect distant memory of a society where authority was tied to ritual, balance, and divine sanction rather than brute force. The subtle leadership of the palaces became, in myth, a king of absolute stature. Then there was the Labyrinth. Greek storytellers described it as a vast, confusing maze built to imprison a monster. No one who entered could find their way out without guidance. This idea likely grew from half-remembered encounters with Minoan palaces, their winding corridors, layered spaces, light wells, and unexpected turns. What had once been an architecture of flow and shared movement became, in the imagination of outsiders, a place of entrapment. Myth did not preserve the intention, only the impression. Within the labyrinth lived the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a creature of strength and hunger, feared and contained. The bull, so central to Minoan ritual and symbolism, was transformed from sacred vitality into monstrous threat. The respectful dance between human and animal became a story of domination and sacrifice. This shift reveals more about the storytellers than the Minoans themselves. Later Greek society, shaped by warfare and hierarchy, interpreted power through conflict. What they inherited from Crete, they reframed in their own image. Even so, fragments of truth remain embedded within the tale. The bull still carries immense power. The labyrinth still suggests complexity rather than simplicity. And Ariadne's thread, the gentle guide that allows escape, echoes an older value. Knowledge passed quietly. Guidance offered rather than imposed. Ariadne herself, a Cretan princess, becomes the bridge between worlds. She helps the hero, but is left behind. Her role diminished once the transition is complete. In her, one can sense the fading of the Minoan world, essential to the journey, but no longer central to the story that follows. These myths are not history, but they are memory shaped by emotion. They preserve the feeling of an older civilization that felt different, sophisticated, mysterious, powerful in unfamiliar ways. Crete, in Greek imagination, was ancient even when Greece was young. Beyond Minos and the Labyrinth, other echoes persist. The importance of the sea, the presence of powerful women, the closeness of gods to nature. These themes, so central to Minoan life, flow quietly into later Greek religion and art, often stripped of their original context, but still resonant. The Minoans did not leave epics written in stone. They left impressions, architectural, artistic, spiritual, that later cultures struggled to explain. Myth became the vessel for this explanation, filling gaps with monsters and heroes, fear and triumph. In this transformation, something was lost. The balance, openness, and gentleness of Minoan society rarely survive intact in myth. But something was also preserved, the sense that Crete had once held a different way of being in the world, one that did not fit neatly into later patterns of conquest and command. For listeners centuries later, these stories still carry a peculiar atmosphere. The labyrinth feels older than the hero who enters it. The bull feels sacred even when feared. The island itself feels like a place where the rules are not quite the same. This is the legacy of the Minoans, not domination, but depth, not empire, but resonance. As myths travelled from mouth to mouth, from island to mainland, from poet to poet, the true Minoans slipped further into shadow. But their spirit endured, refracted through imagination, softened by distance, reshaped by time. And perhaps this was fitting. A civilization that valued movement over monument, ritual over record, and balance over command was never meant to be remembered through rigid history alone. It survived best as atmosphere, as story, as echo. In the quiet space between fact and legend, the Minoans still breathe. In winding paths, in dancing figures, in the uneasy beauty of an ancient island that once stood at the center of the world, and then stepped gently aside, allowing memory to carry what stone and writing could not. When the last echoes of palace life faded from Crete, the island did not fall silent. Waves still traced the shoreline. Wind still moved through olive trees. Mountains still held their watch beneath the sun and stars. What ended was not life itself, but a particular way of living, one that had unfolded slowly, gracefully, and largely without force, before slipping just as quietly into the deep layers of time. For centuries after the Minoans passed from prominence, their presence lingered unnoticed beneath newer worlds. Villages rose where palaces had once stood. Stones were reused, paths redirected, names forgotten. The island adapted again, as it always had. To those who walked its fields in later ages, the ruins were simply part of the land. Weathered walls, fallen columns, half-buried courtyards open to the sky. It would take thousands of years before curious minds began to ask what kind of people had built these places. When modern archaeologists finally peeled back the layers of earth, they did not uncover tales of conquest or triumph carved into stone. Instead, they found fragments of everyday life, jars, tools, frescoes, seals. They found a civilization that had not shouted its power into eternity, but had lived it quietly, trusting that continuity mattered more than remembrance. This is why the Minoans feel different even now. They left no epic poems written in their own voice, no royal inscriptions declaring divine right, no monuments designed to intimidate the future. Their legacy is subtle, visible in the curve of a painted dolphin, the careful balance of a courtyard, the rhythm of trade and ritual woven into daily existence. What remains in the dust is not domination, but intention. The Minoans showed that complexity does not require cruelty. that wealth does not demand oppression, that authority can exist without constant violence. For centuries, they sustained a society built on cooperation, aesthetic harmony, and respect for natural forces they knew they could never fully control. They understood impermanence. Their buildings were rebuilt, their systems adapted, their rituals renewed. They did not expect the world to remain unchanged, nor did they seek to freeze their moment in time. In this way, their disappearance is not a failure of memory, but a reflection of their worldview. They lived fully within their era and allowed it to pass. Later civilizations would remember them imperfectly. Myth reshaped them. Outsiders projected fears and fantasies onto their ruins. The labyrinth became a prison. The bull became a monster. Sacred balance became hidden threat. But even distorted, the memory endured. Because something about Crete's ancient past resisted erasure. Today, when we speak of the Minoans, we often describe them as mysterious. But perhaps they are only mysterious because they did not live in ways we are used to measuring. They did not leave behind the kinds of records we expect. They valued experience over inscription, rhythm over record, presence over proclamation. Their silence is not emptiness, it is space. In that space, we can imagine daily life unfolding slowly, sunlight across stone floors, voices carrying through open courtyards, sails appearing on the horizon, rituals performed without urgency. We can imagine a society that trusted in balance enough to live without walls, and that rebuilt rather than retaliated when the earth itself broke their work apart. And we can imagine, too, the moment when that balance could no longer hold, not because it was wrong, but because the world around it had changed. The Minoans did not fail to adapt. They adapted again and again. What changed was the scale of forces pressing upon them, natural, economic, and human, until adaptation became transformation, and transformation became absorption. In the end, they did not vanish into darkness. They dissolved into continuity. Their influence flowed forward into the Mycenaeans, into Greek myth, into Mediterranean art and thought. Their way of seeing the world as something alive, interconnected, and worthy of respect survived in fragments, resurfacing whenever cultures paused to value harmony over conquest. As night settles over Crete today, the island still holds their memory. Not as a monument, but as atmosphere. In the quiet of caves, in the openness of courtyards exposed to sky, in the way the sea remains both road and reminder. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending of all. A civilization that rose without conquest did not need a dramatic fall. A people who lived within rhythm did not need to be frozen in time. They simply stepped back into the long flow of history, leaving behind enough beauty, enough mystery, enough quiet order for future generations to wonder, not how they ruled, but how they lived. So as this story comes gently to rest, imagine the island at dusk once more. The sea darkens. The air cools. Stone holds the warmth of the day just a little longer. The Minoans sleep now, not forgotten, but folded softly into the earth they knew so well. Their story still breathing in silence, waiting patiently for anyone willing to listen slowly enough to hear it.